The first-class cabin of Flight 217 from Los Angeles to New York was a bubble of exclusivity. Plush leather seats, soft golden lighting, and the quiet hum of whispered conversations created an air of silent luxury. A well-dressed businessman swirled a glass of aged Bordeaux. A tech mogul scrolled through stock market charts, and a Hollywood executive adjusted his Rolex, each absorbed in their own world of success. Among them sat Richard Wells, mid-40s, chiseled confidence, and an aura of self-importance. As a hedge fund manager with an 8-figure portfolio, Richard was used to being among the elite. He thrived in circles where numbers spoke louder than words, and influence was measured by bank accounts. He had always believed that power and wealth were the ultimate markers of success. As the flight attendants made their final checks before takeoff, Richard barely glanced at the man seated across the aisle. At first, the stranger didn't seem worth noticing. Just another passenger, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, jeans, and worn-out sneakers. A beat-up backpack sat at his feet, the kind an average traveler might carry. No designer labels, no flashing of wealth, no air of entitlement. Then, Richard heard the flight attendant's voice. "Mr. Reeves, would you like anything before takeoff?" Richard's eyes snapped toward the man. Reeves? He turned his head fully, studying him more closely. That slightly unkempt hair. That calm, almost meditative expression. The features were familiar, but Richard couldn't believe it. And then it clicked. Keanu Reeves. Richard scoffed. What's he doing here? Sure, the guy was famous, but first class? This was a space for moguls, CEOs, and industry titans. It was for the people who actually moved the world forward, not actors who played pretend for a living. Unable to resist, Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with amusement. "You've got to be kidding me." Keanu turned his head slightly, acknowledging Richard with a polite nod, but said nothing. Richard smirked, shaking his head as he gestured toward the seat. "So, what's the deal? Studio paid for your ticket? Or are you finally cashing in on those Matrix residual?" A few passengers nearby looked up from their tablets and newspapers. Some recognized Keanu and watched quietly, while others exchanged glances, sensing the tension. The flight attendant stiffened slightly, but Keanu remained relaxed. "I paid for my ticket," Keanu said simply, his voice calm and even. Richard chuckled again, shaking his head. "Right. And I'm the next James Bond." He took a sip of his wine, flashing a condescending smile. "Look, don't take it personally. I just don't get it. I mean, you're famous, sure. But first class? This section is for real businessmen, guys who actually run the world." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying the man. There was no anger in his eyes, no irritation, just quiet observation, as if he were trying to understand Richard rather than react to him. "I guess we all run the world in different ways," Keanu said finally. Richard scoffed. "Yeah, well, some of us run it with billions in assets, not movie lines." He leaned back in his seat, stretching out his arms as if he'd just made an undeniable point. "It's funny, you know. People like me. We build industries, create jobs, fund innovation. Meanwhile, you memorize lines, hit your marks, and pretend to be a hero." Keanu just smiled again, nodding slightly, as if to acknowledge Richard's words without agreeing. A few rows away, a middle-aged woman who had been listening turned toward Richard, an incredulous expression on her face. She was well-dressed, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes. "You do know who you're talking to, right?" she said, unable to hide her disbelief. Richard scoffed. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to." He gestured toward Keanu. "He's an actor. He pretends for a living. Meanwhile, I'm out here making real money, creating jobs, shaping industries." He waved a hand around the cabin. "This, my friend, is the real world. And in the real world, money talks." Keanu simply smiled, giving a small nod as if he understood. But there was something about his quiet demeanor, his refusal to engage in the arrogance, that unsettled Richard. Then, the flight attendant returned, placing a cup of black coffee in front of Keanu. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to say, my brother met you once." A few years ago, at a hospital, he was going through chemo, and you took the time to sit with him, talk to him for over an hour. Her voice softened. He always said it was the best day of his life. Richard blinked. He wasn't expecting that. Keanu looked up, his eyes gentle. How's he doing now? The flight attendant smiled sadly. He passed away last year. But he always talked about that day. Said it made him feel like he mattered. Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. I'm really sorry to hear that, he said softly. A quiet pause filled the space. The flight attendant gave a grateful nod and walked away, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. Several passengers exchanged glances, as if realizing they were witnessing something deeper than a casual encounter. Richard shifted in his seat, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. He had expected a defensive comeback, a smug retort, but Keanu had given him neither. Instead, he had met arrogance with humility, insult with patience. And then, as if on cue, another voice spoke from across the aisle. You know, said the silver-haired woman, crossing her arms, if you're going to measure a man's worth, maybe money isn't the best metric. Richard turned to her, frowning. Oh, and what would you suggest? She smiled slightly, nodding toward Keanu. Try kindness. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced at Keanu, who had gone back to staring out the window, as if he hadn't just exposed a fundamental flaw in Richard's entire worldview, without even trying. And then, the truth started to unfold. Richard shifted in his seat, gripping the stem of his wine glass a little tighter. He had expected Keanu to get defensive, maybe even throw back a sarcastic remark. Instead, the actor had responded with patience, humility, even, and that unsettled him. For years, Richard had built his life around the idea that power meant dominance, that success meant having the loudest voice in the room. And yet, here sat Keanu Reeves, famous, wealthy, and universally beloved, who didn't seem to care about proving anything to anyone. The hum of the aircraft engines filled the silence between them. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Look, I'm not trying to be an ass. Keanu turned to him, one eyebrow slightly raised. Richard sighed. Okay, maybe I was being an ass, he admitted, rubbing his temple, but I just don't get it. Why does everyone act like you're some kind of saint? You're just a guy who got lucky in Hollywood. A low chuckle came from the woman across the aisle, the one who had defended Keanu earlier. Richard glanced at her, annoyed. What? She leaned forward slightly. Do you even know the first thing about this man? Richard frowned. I know he's an actor, and actors get paid ridiculous amounts of money to pretend for a living. The woman shook her head. You really don't get it, do you? She gestured toward Keanu. Go on. Tell him. Keanu let out a soft breath, glancing down at his hands before speaking. It's not a big deal, he said quietly. Oh, come on, the woman pressed. Tell him about the stunt crew. Richard raised an eyebrow. What stunt crew? Keanu hesitated, then shrugged. After the Matrix sequels, I gave a portion of my earnings to the stunt team and special effects crew. They worked just as hard as I did, harder, in a lot of cases. They deserved it. Richard blinked. Wait, you gave away your money? Keanu nodded. Yeah, they were the real heroes on set. I just wanted to make sure they were taken care of. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. How much are we talking here? Like, a few thousand? Maybe $1 million? The woman across the aisle smirked. Try $75 million. Richard nearly choked on his wine. $75 million? Keanu just gave a small nod, as if it wasn't a big deal. Richard gaped at him. That's insane. That's more money than most people see in their lifetime. Why would you just give it away? Keanu shrugged. They earned it. Richard sat back, stunned. He had spent his whole life accumulating wealth, climbing the corporate ladder, securing his place among the elite. And here was a man who had everything, who could have hoarded every last cent, and instead, he had just let it go. But the woman wasn't finished. Tell him about the children's hospitals. Keanu shook his head, smiling slightly. That's private. Richard scoffed. Oh, come on. Now I'm curious. The woman turned back to Richard. Keanu has been quietly funding children's hospitals for years. He even set up a foundation, but he never put his name on it. Didn't want the attention. Richard narrowed his eyes. Is that true? Keanu simply nodded. The pieces started to click together in Richard's mind. This man, who sat humbly in first class without an entourage, who dressed like an average guy, who didn't feel the need to flaunt his success. He wasn't pretending to be humble. He was humble. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He was used to measuring people by their wealth, their power, their influence. But here was someone who had all of those things and still chose kindness over dominance. The silence stretched between them. Then, in a quiet voice, Richard asked, "Do you ever regret not keeping more for yourself?" Keanu thought for a moment before answering. No. He turned back to the window, watching the clouds drift by. I'd rather be remembered for how I treated people than how much I made. Richard swallowed hard. He had spent his entire life chasing a version of success that suddenly felt hollow. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been running in the wrong direction all along. For the rest of the flight, Richard sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had boarded this plane believing he was one of the most important people in the room. A self-made man, a powerhouse of finance, a leader of the modern world. And yet, in just under an hour, everything he thought he knew about success, wealth, and legacy had been shaken to its core. He stole another glance at Keanu. The actor sat quietly, gazing out the window, his expression calm and unbothered, as if the conversation had never even happened. Richard, on the other hand, felt like his world had tilted. He had spent his entire life building an empire, convinced that money was the only thing that mattered. But what had all his wealth truly given him? He had cars, houses, and private jets, but he couldn't remember the last time he had done something that truly mattered, not just for himself, but for someone else. And then, almost against his own will, a memory surfaced, one he had buried long ago. A memory resurfaces 20 years ago. Before he had made it big, Richard had been just another young man trying to make a name for himself on Wall Street. He had worked brutal hours, barely sleeping, pushing himself to the breaking point. One winter night, he had left the office late, exhausted and frustrated, when he saw a homeless man sitting on the steps of a closed coffee shop. The man's clothes were tattered, his fingers red from the cold. Richard, in a rare moment of impulse, had bought the man a hot meal and sat with him for a few minutes, listening to his story. For the first time in a long time, Richard had felt something more than ambition. He had felt human. But then, success had swept him away. He had buried that night under years of deals, profits, and networking, convincing himself that kindness was for the weak, that generosity was just a PR move for the rich. Until now. Until Keanu Reeves had reminded him that real power wasn't in how much you could accumulate, but in how much you could give away. A question that lingers. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the silence between them. You really don't care about money, do you? Keanu turned his head slightly, offering a small smile. It's useful, he admitted. It makes life easier. But it doesn't define who I am. Richard exhaled, shaking his head. That's crazy, man. Money is power. It's everything. Keanu studied him for a moment. Is it? Richard opened his mouth to argue, but for the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. The silver-haired woman across the aisle chimed in. Let me ask you something, she said, folding her hands in her lap. When you die, what do you want people to say about you? Richard frowned. What? She repeated the question. What do you want to be remembered for? That you had a great stock portfolio? That you drove an expensive car? Richard hesitated. I guess I want to be remembered for my success. Keanu tilted his head. And what does success look like to you? Richard was about to respond when he realized he didn't have an answer. What did success look like? 4 years, he had measured it in numbers. Deals closed. Millions earned. Assets secured. But sitting here, in this first-class cabin, across from a man who had all the money in the world and still chose to give it away, Richard felt, for the first time, that maybe he had been chasing the wrong thing. A moment of truth, the seatbelt sign dinged as the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing. Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I've spent my whole life chasing money, he admitted, almost to himself, working insane hours, making sure I was always ahead of the next guy. But sitting here, listening to you, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe I got it wrong. Keanu smiled, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. It's never too late to rethink things. Richard let out a dry chuckle. Easy for you to say. You're Keanu Reeves. Everyone loves you. Keanu shrugged. That doesn't mean anything if I don't deserve it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. Legacy isn't about how much you earn. It's about how much you matter to the people around you. The words hit Richard like a freight train. Legacy. He had spent years building an empire, but if he were gone tomorrow, who would truly care? His employees? His clients? The investors who only saw him as a number on a balance sheet? Would anyone say he had changed their life for the better? Would anyone miss him? The final lesson as the plane touched down. Richard stared out the window, lost in thought. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their things. Keanu stood, reaching for his backpack. So unassuming, so unlike every other celebrity Richard had ever met. Before he could think too much about it, Richard blurted out, "Hey." Keanu turned back. Richard hesitated. Then, for the first time in years, he spoke from the heart. I think I'd like to change that answer. Keanu smiled. Good. Richard extended a hand. Keanu shook it firmly, then nodded before making his way off the plane. Richard stood there for a long moment, watching as other passengers filed past him. For years, he had thought money was the only currency that mattered. But today, Keanu Reeves had taught him something different. Kindness was a currency, too. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth a lot more. The ripple effect that night. Richard couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He sat in his Manhattan penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, thinking about everything Keanu had said. And then, before he could stop himself, he did something he hadn't done in decades. He pulled out his phone and searched for local charities. A shelter for homeless youth, a nonprofit for cancer patients, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. And, without overthinking it, he made a donation. A big one. Not for a tax break, not for publicity, but because, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to make a difference. And as he hit confirm on the transaction, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fulfilled. Because maybe, just maybe, success wasn't about what you had. Maybe it was about what you gave away. The end.